Or do you say so?
Yep, it's on.
Okay. All right, thank you, Troy. And so I'm here representing the Sierra Club, and what I'm going to talk to you today about is organic waste, and food waste in particular. And I'm going to talk about why this is an environmental issue, and one option that city dwellers have, like yourselves, to reduce their personal impact in this area: composting with worm bins. And so what I have here is a bin full of worms, and I'm going to get back to that in just a minute. But first I'd like to just say, when I talk about organic waste, what I'm referring to is two main things. The yard trimmings, which are leaves, branches, anything you sweep up and put into your green bins. It's that and food waste. Now, the stuff you put in green bins, I'm just going to say as an aside, you might think that that goes somewhere other than the landfill, right? Well, oftentimes you'd be wrong about that. In most cities in LA and Orange counties, the stuff that is in green bins goes to the same landfill as the rest of your garbage. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go down to the Sierra Club table, and that's my shameless plug for that. Awesome. So now going back to food waste as an environmental issue. In general, this is important because of, one, the harms of landfilling, and two, the astounding waste of resources and nutrients that it represents. And so I'll just begin with some facts and figures to give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem. According to the EPA, every year Americans produce over 250 million tons of municipal solid waste. Of that translates to about 4.5 pounds per person per day. Now of that total, 30% of it is organics. If you include paper, which comes from trees, that total goes to well over 50%. Food waste itself represents 15% of municipal solid waste. That translates into 36 million tons per year. Now, since almost no food waste is recovered for recycling or other beneficial reuse, that means that it translates into the single largest component of what is actually taken to landfills. Over 20% of what gets landfilled is food waste. In California, 25% of residential waste is food. So, both as a nation and in California in particular, we waste an astounding amount of food, and we send it to landfills. Now, what is the major reason that sending it to a landfill is an environmental issue? The answer is emissions. When you entomb organic matter in a landfill, it's deprived of oxygen and it begins to break down anaerobically. When it breaks down anaerobically, it produces methane. And methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas that's particularly powerful in the near term. Depending on the estimate, over a 20-year time horizon, the global warming impact of methane is between 70 and 100 times as that of carbon dioxide, which is quite significant. Now, food waste is particularly important with respect to organics because it's high in moisture and it's high in degradable organic carbon, which means it breaks down very quickly and it produces methane very quickly. And that's also relevant because in modern landfills there are gas capture systems, but they capture some of the methane that is produced. However, these are typically phased in over several years on an active landfill operating cell, which means that within the first few years, before these landfill gas capture systems are operating, most of the food has already broken down and released this methane into the atmosphere. Now, these methane capture systems do actually significantly offset the impact of methane. However, they do not eliminate it. And the gas that's captured is either flared, which means it's burned away, or it's used to generate energy. But this is actually, and so people think this offsets it, but it doesn't. It's a very minor effect. And in fact, certain landfill practices, such as making the landfill wetter, can actually be counterproductive because even though they result in more energy being generated, that is more than offset by the increased methane leak. Something that's helpful sometimes is to think of in terms of cars. And if we use EPA numbers, the impact of diverting the 1.6 million tons of food waste that are produced in LA and Orange County alone over 20 years would be equivalent between removing somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million cars from the road. And that's a lot of cars even for LA. There's another reason this landfill situation is important, and that is that landfill land is getting scarcer and scarcer. And Puente Hills, which is the major landfill that services the LA area, is scheduled to close on Halloween of this year. That waste that cities bring there is going to have to go somewhere. Moreover, California now has a statewide mandate for 75% recycling and diversion. Since organics represent 30% of all waste, something has to be done. Now, beyond these issues, sending food to landfills represents a huge waste of nutrients and resources. These are millions of tons of organic carbon and things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are actually the content of chemical fertilizers. If we composted this instead, it could be returned to the soil and at least partially offset chemical fertilizer use. And chemical fertilizer use is actually one of the major reasons that crop production contributes to global warming, and is a very significant contributor to global warming. Beyond that offsetting benefit, composting itself sequesters carbon in the soil and has other multiplier effects that are directly anti-global warming. And the final thing I want to talk about when I mention in this is that 50% of the land area of the United States and 70% of the fresh water are used in agriculture. Now, a 2009 study estimated that almost 40% of the food that enters the U.S. food supply is ultimately wasted, and most of this is completely unnecessary waste. Doing the numbers, that means that 25% of all the fresh water used in the United States goes to food that is just thrown away. It's a complete waste. 20% of the entire U.S. land area is used to produce food that is wasted. Moreover, because of the energy cost of this needless production, that translates to 300 million barrels of oil a year. So, in sum, landfilling of food waste has a direct deleterious effect through methane production. It also diverts resources that could both offset global warming activities and directly contribute to anti-global warming, and it's a huge land and water and oil use as well. So I hope that I've convinced you that food waste is a problem of national and global significance. So a handful of cities now do compost their food waste, but not most. And if you have a yard, traditional composting is an option for you. But if you don't, like most apartment dwellers, what can you do? Well, one option is composting with worms. Now, and what I have here in front of you is a simple bin, and it's full of worms. And a worm bin is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bin with worms. And so all you need the bin, you need some bedding to put the worms in, and you need your worms. And then you simply add your food waste, and the worms will consume it and turn it into a high-value compost. So what do you do if you want to set up your very own worm bin? Well, the first thing to do in big friendly letters is don't panic. The worms, it doesn't smell. That's the first question I always get. It's low maintenance, and the worms are not going to invade your apartment. So don't panic. Now, first thing you need is the bin. Well, commercial bins are available, but they can be pricey. And a simple do-it-yourself option is to just get a Rubbermaid bin, a 10 or 14 gallon bin from Home Depot, drill some holes in it, and you have your bin. You want to drill holes because you want to keep the bin aerated and give the worms some air. Now, the second thing you need is a bedding. Now, you can use either finished compost from Home Depot, or you can use coconut coir from hydroponic shops. You can use shredded newspaper, which is free and widely available, or you can use peat moss. But I don't recommend using peat moss because it's a non-renewable resource. Now, okay, you have your bin, you have your bedding. Now you just need your worms. So where can you get those? Well, there are a lot of sites on the internet that will actually ship you worms through the U.S. mail. That's right, live worms pass through the mail with surprising regularity. And that's how I got mine, actually. There are also maybe people around town who can give you worms. So what do you feed your worms? Well, sometimes people will produce big lists of what you can and can't feed, but really, you can pretty much give them anything. You can give them all your vegetable matter. You can give them eggshells. You can give them coffee grounds. Include the filter. I produce lots of coffee grounds, and they all go to the worms. The only things that you really shouldn't give them are meat and really oily foods. And even then, that's just for your comfort, not theirs. They're perfectly happy to eat it, but it might smell a little bit because meat can go rancid. The one other thing that you may want to avoid is citrus peels. But other than that, anything goes. Now, a worm bin isn't just a bin filled with worms. It's a whole ecosystem. Because worms don't just eat food that's lying around. The food has to decay a little bit. And for food to begin decaying, you need a complex community of microorganisms. They begin to decay the food, the worms eat it. Then after a while, you get a whole community of camp followers and worm bin groupies that show up. And don't worry, they're all harmless. And what's more, they will stay in the bin. They won't invade your apartment either. So you get things like roly-polies, springtails, all sorts of little bugs will come in and contribute to the decomposition process. But the worms are the main event. The one thing you do want to avoid is flies. And that's very easy to avoid. All you have to do is make sure you bury your food. As long as there's not exposed food mass, the flies aren't going to lay their eggs in it. It won't be a problem. One other thing, your worms are going to breed. So you start with one bin, it'll fill up. They'll expand to their capacity, but you can expand your worms ad nauseum. You can have a whole empire of worm bins, which is what I might have. Now, eventually, so you put your food waste in here. What do they do with it? They eat it and they poop it out, and that is a highly valued compost product. And so eventually you're going to have this, and we call it vermicompost, which is a fancy name for worm compost. Now, there are two problems. One is how do you get it out? Two is what do you do with it? And this is the good kind of problem. So to get it out, the basic principle is you take advantage of the worm's photophobia. Worms hate the light, and so all you have to do is take your lid off and they'll burrow down. You scrape off a top layer, set it aside, wait for them to burrow down again. You just keep scraping it off. And that's the basic principle of most worm harvesting methods, which is reasonably easy. There are also fancier, larger scale commercial bins that you can get that do other methods. But for our purposes, I'm just talking about simple bins. Now, what do you do with it? Well, it's a highly valued soil amendment. So if you have friends that garden, you can give it to them. If you're lucky enough to have a garden yourself, you can use it. You can use it on houseplants. You can just throw it on just about any soil and it won't harm it and it'll improve its productivity. And following along those lines, I want to talk about the benefits of worm compost itself as a product. This is not just a method to avoid the harms of landfills. This is something that is highly valued. If you go to a nursery, this stuff costs about 10 times as much as any other organic compost. And there's a reason. This compost is extremely rich in microorganisms. You recall I was talking about the ecosystem that evolves? Well, this is essential to the workings of the product as well. These microorganisms increase the availability of nutrients in the soil, and they've been shown in various studies to improve seedling germination, flowering, crop growth, and yield. They tend to imbue resistance to various pesticides and fungal diseases. Moreover, they also improve the microbial communities in the soil, especially with respect to the mycorrhizae, which are the beneficial fungi. Oh, and one other thing. If you do get worms, don't cut them in half. Some worms have a limited ability to regenerate, but this usually only applies to the head region. So what you're going to end up with if you cut your worms in half is maybe a shorter worm who's very unhappy. And that's the best case scenario. Also, worms are living things, and it's not nice to cut them in half. Now, most people to whom I mentioned that I have worm bins are puzzled, to say the least. But I just want to emphasize that food waste and waste in general is an integral part of life. And but normally we just view it as a hauling problem. You know, out of sight, out of mind. Once I got worms, I became much more aware of my own wasteful habits. And actually, what's kind of incredible is how little I have to take the trash out these days. And so, just what I want to conclude with is that food waste is a problem of both national and global significance. However, its generation and management occurs at the local level, at cities, and at the individual level, and the people who actually generate it. And so, this is something that you can actually have an impact on through your own behavioral choices that matters at the global scale. Just becoming more aware of your own food waste goes a long way in reducing it, because land use and other things like that are by far the biggest problem. However, some waste is always inevitable, and what we can do with that food waste that's inevitable is we can either treat it as garbage and take it to landfills, where it causes all sorts of problems, or we can treat it as a valuable resource, because it is a valuable resource. And one way that you yourself can take advantage of this is through worm composting at home. And all you need is a bin. Thank you. And I'll be at the Sierra Club table with my worm bin if anyone wants to come see or come up and take a look. Thank you.
All right.